Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to review our brief, Rough Sleeping in Cities, presented by Nelson Decura, Paul Hartman, Hannah McKay, Victoria Peta, and Natalie Schmidt. Next slide, please. Before we begin, we would like to respectfully acknowledge that the government of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Next slide, please. The issue at hand is that catch-all approaches by previous governments regarding homelessness show significant gaps in the data and understanding needed to address encampments and rough sleeping in Alberta. Next slide, please. With the rise in complex homelessness, specifically around rough sleep and encampments, the government of Alberta must create a robust strategy to further address the complicated needs of vulnerable Albertans sleeping rough, to gain a greater understanding of rough sleep and encampments, and to provide tools for civil society organizations to execute their work better. We are briefing the Ministers of Health, Community and Social Services, Justice and Solicitor General, Executive Council, Municipal Affairs, and Communications and Public Engagement bodies from our respective ministries to propose a policy solution to address this ongoing crisis. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Nelson. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Natalie. I'm going to provide a quick background. So rough sleepers are the most visible form of homelessness. Despite this being the case, little is known about rough sleepers and the challenges that they face. What is known, however, is that rough sleepers are often characterized by sleeping outside, or in some cases, sleeping in empty buildings, bus shelters, or even cars. The common theme amongst these places is that they're inhabitable for humans. They create challenges for safety, dignity, and the health and well-being of these people. Unfortunately, little is known about the specific challenges to the health, safety, dignity, and well-being of these folks. This is important because some social services, like shelters, are not utilized by these people, and the services that they need are not available to them at times. The issue of rough sleeping in Alberta has distinct challenges. Not only does Alberta have to contend with its large population of rough sleepers, but there are also distinct issues related to indigeneity and climate. I want to first point out that Alberta accounts for 20% of the country's rough sleepers. This is particularly concerning given that it is one of the highest rates in Canada, and the number of rough sleepers has significantly increased since the start of the pandemic. Another thing that ties in with the sheer magnitude of rough sleepers in Alberta is the number of Indigenous people rough sleeping in Alberta. Specifically, Edmonton has a large Indigenous population of rough sleepers, and that indicates that they face some particular challenges to getting their needs met. Lastly, a very distinct challenge to rough sleepers in Alberta is the weather in Alberta. 180 nights out of the year is below freezing, and for an additional 25 nights a year is below -20. This creates severe health risks related to things like frostbites, hypothermia, and other cold-borne illnesses. I also want to shed light to how contemporary conditions of rough sleepers are changing. As I mentioned, the pandemic has added additional challenges to rough sleepers, and in addition, the opioid crisis has created a massive concern related to health and well-being. So as I mentioned earlier, the number of rough sleepers has significantly increased since the start of the pandemic, and this has become very visible as we've seen uprisings in encampments like the one we saw in downtown Edmonton of 2020. COVID-19 has limited access to shelters due to concerns over things like viral transmission and other health related issues. On top of the pandemic, the opioid crisis has completely changed the reality of drug abuse related rough sleeping, specifically related to fentanyl use. Before going into the health concerns of fentanyl, I just want to mention that fentanyl makes it a lot more difficult for people to rebound from intoxication compared to alcohol, which was previously believed to be the most prevalent abused substance. Given the recovery time for opioids could take days compared to the roughly one night from alcohol, this reduces the ability for people to get back up on their feet. The other concern with fentanyl is specific to the climate of Alberta and the inability to confidently treat somebody with an overdose. The liquid antidote, naloxone, becomes unusable when frozen, and if it's defrosted, it has 1/3 of the effectiveness. I also want to mention that mental health concerns should also be noted to the changing landscape of rough sleeping. The changing nature of rough sleeping and the distinct challenges to rough sleepers in Alberta has been inadequately addressed by previous governments. In 2009, the 10-year plan to end homelessness was not successful, and the sentiments of that plan still carry on today. In addition, local law enforcement efforts have been ineffective to address the root causes of rough sleeping, and provincial and federal funds have not addressed the needs of rough sleepers. The 2009 plan to end homelessness in 10 years was based on the principles of rapid rehousing, providing client-centered supports, and preventing homelessness. The concern is that through our understanding of homelessness supports and housing stability, the last 10 years have seen significant change in the landscape of homelessness. And as mentioned, the growing concern about mental health and by extension dignity require more support than we believed 10 years ago. Another issue with the efforts of how shelters were addressed is how shelters are addressed. In our conversations with some of the largest shelters with some of the public servants in Alberta, we were made aware that shelters, possibly including the largest shelter in Edmonton, have deficiencies when it comes to cultural sensitivity. This may help to explain the lack of shelter take-up and therefore the number of people rough sleeping, specifically for Indigenous and LGBTQ+ communities. The last comment I want to take, and the last comment is particularly important. While we understand that things are changing, we don't understand exactly how. And embracing the fact that we do not know will allow us to untangle from failed policies and programs that have tried to address the issue in the past. A key reason for the failures of these policies and the programs is because of the underpinned assumptions of rough sleepers, which has not allowed governments to address the actual concerns of these people. Could I get the next slide, please? So the first stakeholder I want to mention is Albertans. Albertans that rough sleep deal with the health, safety, dignity challenges that I had mentioned earlier. Albertans that do not rough sleep also have an interest in ensuring the well-being of rough sleepers. Unfortunately, many Albertans are only separated from being unhoused by a bad economic period, falling to substance abuse or other personal crises. Ensuring the needs of rough sleepers are addressed will reduce the consequences of other Albertans that may fall in hard times. The next group of stakeholders I want to bring up is civil society organizations in Alberta. Alberta is lucky to have numerous qualified civil society organizations that are taking on challenges of homelessness, poverty, and rough sleepers. I want to mention a few, like the Boyle Street Community Services, Homeward Trust Edmonton, and Basel Center, but there's many others. Per the government's priorities, we can best leverage the expertise of civil society organizations by providing them with the requisite tools to address rough sleeping issues. The next group of stakeholders that are important to mention are public service providers. This includes shelters, substance treatment providers, and community organizations that provide services. Albertan municipalities and law enforcement work in coordination with public service providers to give rough sleepers and unhoused people access to these services. The last group of stakeholders I want to address are all three orders of government. They are the primary funders of public service providers, with the provincial government having the greatest direct contribution to civil society organizations and public service providers. Municipalities are directly responsible for addressing the concerns of rough sleepers. However, the provincial and federal governments also have a responsibility to the well-being of their citizens. Having said all that, I want to pass the floor to my colleague, Paul, to take over. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Nelson, for that. So, of course, there are risks of action. One of them is that we may realize that the problem is just too large to solve. This issue is substantial and it is growing, but we don't have all the information to capture just how many people are rough sleeping and exactly why. So in conducting research, the problem might appear overwhelming and nearly impossible to address. But we have to remember, there's no silver bullet solution, but we must begin to take gradual action to protect this vulnerable population. And the core issue solutions and interventions are not immediately seen. Again, because this issue is so complex, research is required as a first step. Therefore, positive results from new policy development may not be immediately visible. And of course, in the meantime, we will need to have a continuation strategy to fund temporary solutions that may seem somewhat band-aid-like for short-term benefits, but these are absolutely necessary. And rough sleepers may be wary of intervention due to poor previous experiences. Because previous government strategies have lacked strong policy outcomes, rough sleepers may be wary from government intervention that could once again produce insufficient results. Again, as Nelson spoke to, marginalized groups are overrepresented in this population. So this demographic may be distrustful because prior planning has failed to understand the cultural sensitivity and unique needs. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, there are risks of inaction. So like we've said, we've looked at the 10-year strategy and it technically expired several years ago, but continuing with it may lead to inadequate policy outcomes as it's still being used as a rough guide to address the issue. However, as discussed, circumstances have absolutely changed in this time, and this document is no longer the best course of action. On top of that, the pandemic has flipped this world upside down and it has had severe implications on this demographic. For example, shelters may be overcrowded and some may avoid them for health concerns and choose to be outside instead. Now, of course, we still lack that qualitative data on vulnerable Albertans, specifically with rough sleepers and those in encampments. So without action, there are still many unknowns of who rough sleepers are, and we need to understand the needs and stories to develop concrete policy. In particular, we often lack individual level data behind rough sleeping to understand how these individuals have come to this situation. And of course, rough sleepers may increase and still feel unsafe in shelters. As we've seen, undercurrent strategies, they have failed to mitigate problems surrounding rough sleeping, nor do they address issues within the shelters themselves. Therefore, this trouble can only be assumed to grow. And substance abuse related issues may not be addressed. Like we've seen, we are in the midst of a crisis with the opioid related deaths, and it's on the rise. In Alberta in 2020, we ranked 3rd in number of opioid related deaths among all the provinces. And finally, inaction would fail to ensure the dignity, health, and safety of all Albertans, including those who are vulnerable. This commitment is a staple of this government. Therefore, new strategy is absolutely necessary. You can move it to the next slide and I'll pass it over to my colleague, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Paul. So today we're bringing 2 policy options to the table to address the challenge at hand, and we will discuss the details of both. We will propose a preferred approach that we recommend ministers closely consider going forward. Each option contains strategies that will directly address rough sleeping in encampments. Although one option takes a step back to begin addressing what previous governments have gotten wrong and what this government can do to make the situation better and to focus on the dignity, health, and safety of Albertans. Next slide, please. As noted, we're proposing 2 different policy options. The initial option is a recommended alternate option. This policy option includes pursuing current state policy with additional funding specifically allocated to municipalities to address rough sleeping and encampments as these challenges arise in Alberta. This option would continue to address homelessness in Alberta while also allocating resources to organizations that may need crucial financial support in addressing encampments and rough sleeping in their respective communities. The government of Alberta announced the Civil Society Fund in 2019, and in 2020, they allocated $20 million over 3 years to expand civil society's capacity to address social problems facing Albertans. If this policy option would be chosen, we are proposing a direct allocation from the second round of funding to fund civil society organizations that can build their capacity in addressing and combating rough sleeping and encampments. Further, the government of Alberta would continue the following initiatives without any significant changes or budget implications. That includes supporting the Housing First initiative, which provides annual provincial funding to community-based organizations in Alberta's 7 major cities, which allows them to deliver the Housing First programming and support local homelessness priorities. Support trusted partners in the operation of emergency shelters, and finally, continue to invest in the provincial affordable housing strategy that sets a path for sustainable, affordable housing systems that will hopefully make life better for Albertans now and into the future. This option will put a small allocation towards combating rough sleeping encampments in Alberta municipalities, while continuing to support investments and initiatives already supported by the government of Alberta. Next slide, please.
It is clear from the evidence presented that there's a lot we don't know about homelessness, but specifically rough sleeping in encampments. Governments that have come before you have had it wrong. The solutions they presented to Albertans have only been Band-Aid solutions. This government, with a strong focus on the dignity, health, and safety of all Albertans, has the opportunity to get this right through investing in a robust data strategy and essential supports directed at Alberta's strong group of civil society organizations. Our preferred approach going forward is to begin exploring the possibility of implementing a robust data strategy to ensure the government gets addressing rough sleeping encampments right. The strategy would put forward and hope to achieve the following objectives. What is rough sleeping in Alberta? Who are the individuals that are rough sleeping and what are their unique needs? Where are the gaps in the services currently offered? And how can the government continue to support civil society organizations to ensure high quality communities and lifestyles for all Albertans? The strategy would be a partnership between the government of Alberta and civil society organizations, with the government of Alberta housing the data, ensuring it would be readily available for evidence-based action by government, civil society organizations, and groups working directly with homeless Albertans. Further, we're recommending that the government allocate specific funds to civil society organizations to launch community action teams in hard-hit Alberta communities. Teams would be dedicated to supporting rough sleepers and getting them the supports they need from the cold and or out of the heat, and helping them with ailments or certain needs, all while beginning the crucial data collection that we might not understand about the Albertans who are rough sleeping currently. These teams would ideally include individuals with various degrees of expertise in supporting folks who are experiencing a wide range of complex issues. These teams have proved to be important in communities such as Grand Prairie, Fort McMurray, and here in Edmonton. With this, we're recommending the government allocate an initial $10 million from Budget 2022's commitment to $193 million allocated to supporting Albertans experiencing homelessness and women's shelters to this initiative. The strategy will help inform current and future initiatives supported by the government to end homelessness, understand rough sleeping in a more in-depth way, and create a centralized and accessible database for stakeholders working to ensure the dignity and health and security of Alberta's most vulnerable. I'm going to be passing the slides back to Paul. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Victoria. So in terms of our timeline for our data strategy, we'd categorize this into three phases. So in the short term, current programs remain. We continue to support various services for rough sleepers as these programs are absolutely necessary. But here we start to develop the framework and engage with various stakeholders to establish the beginning and continuation of our data strategy that moves Alberta on a concrete path forward. In the medium term, we begin with test sites across the province to begin the collection of data, and we continuously evaluate how the process is working. This test period gives us time to rethink our methods and make adjustments to our methodology when and if necessary to ensure that it is working to the best of its abilities. Now, in the long term, we work with stakeholders across the province to assist us to collect data on rough sleeping and contribute to our base. Finally, we work with developers to create a base for civil society actors and government officials to access. Importantly, this is a continuous data set, and in doing so, the evolving information will assist in the formation of further policy development to best help the rising demographic of these individuals. So we can move it to the next and final slide. I want to say thank you for listening to our briefing. We're looking forward to your questions and comments. We'll just open up the floor.
Well, Tiger team, thank you very much. That was a very concise presentation, and we are looking forward to raising some questions with you. So let me start now with Pam McCurry. Pam McCurry. Oh, Pam, you're muted.
Okay, there we go.
Yep.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering here, you talked about a role for the federal government briefly in your discussions. Moving forward, I mean, as I understand it, you've got a $10 million option that you're putting on the table. But what would you see as the role of the federal government? So I'm thinking sort of intergovernmental partnerships here. What would you see as the role of the federal government moving forward, and why would they want to engage? Are there any legal obligations, or is it strictly policy, or kind of what's behind it?
Who wants to take that?
I can take that one.
Okay, Victoria.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that question. I think the role for the federal government, at least after our initial stages of kind of understanding where we'd like to take our data strategy, but also in kind of developing these community action teams, I think that we would look for a partnership with the federal government to invest in these strategies in Alberta and hope to invest more broadly intergovernmentally. We see that this could be a policy solution and a policy option for other jurisdictions across Canada by ensuring that each jurisdiction has accurate data, good understanding about rough sleeping and encampments, but also while being directly on the ground, getting folks the services and help that they need in a more direct way. This will ensure more vibrant communities across the country. I think the federal government has a huge role to play in this in terms of partnering with Alberta initially, but also partnering with other jurisdictions to ensure that we have safe communities across the country.
Okay, Pam, further, any follow-up on that?
No, I'll pass to the next. And
Okay, let me go to Alan Northcott. Alan.
Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting set of solutions presented. If I'm understanding it correctly, the solution you're proposing has a data collection and use strategy baked into it. And if I'm understanding correctly, I think you mentioned that you would rely, at least to some significant extent, on civil society organizations to collect that data that would then get used. Could you talk to us a bit about what you think the biggest challenges would be around that data piece? Who's going to collect it? What about privacy? All of those issues. What would you propose to do to address those data questions?
Who wants that? Nelson.
Yeah, I'll hop in there. Thank you for the question. So one of the reasons that we decided to go with civil society organizations to collect this data is, first off, they're already collecting this data to some degree, but one of the big problems is that it's very difficult and very fragmented to get your hands on to create robust policy solutions. So there are some areas that collect data on the number of people rough sleeping. Others will count shelter usage, but nothing really kind of takes into account all these sorts of things. And there's a big gap in terms of qualitative data. Another thing we believe civil society organizations are well equipped to do is to address more marginalized communities because of potential distrust with government officials with these marginalized groups, specifically Indigenous groups. We think civil society organizations would be best equipped to address, to collect this sort of data. And in terms of privacy, we believe that these will be kind of optional, like optional interview type collection strategies, amongst other types of quantitative data. So we think that protecting them under like government like data sets will address those type of issues.
Okay, let me turn now to other member, Trina Fraser. Sorry, Trina Fraser.
Hi, I do feel that Nelson kind of touched base on the answer to the question I was about to pose, but I'm still going to ask that question because there may be more to add to it. So throughout your presentation, you did mention a lot about cultural sensitivity. Nelson, you just spoke on the fact of in regards to marginalized communities. It's my thought and wonder, and you did answer this somewhat. You addressed the need for cultural sensitivity. How do you see this being addressed as it comes to making new policies or developing new policies? Who do you see best fitted to be at the table to help support that?
Nelson, do you want to take that or somebody else?
I can add a little bit to
Okay,
that.
Paul, go ahead. Yep.
Thank you. Really one of the big hearts of this policy solution is civil society that has that cultural understanding. So they're absolutely necessary to be stakeholders in this. The role of the government here is to also facilitate civil society in gathering this information. So they definitely need to be a part of the solution as well. And of course, here we're calling for a little bit of a step back to rethink our policy. And once we gather that data, we can further develop policy that will encourage and benefit marginalized communities who are in this demographic.
Okay, let me turn, any follow-up there, Trina? Sorry, anything?
Good,
no?
thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go now to James, James Hughes. James, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thank you as well. So it sounds to me like this is a strategy, if I'm trying to really boil it down, the recommended strategy is to collect data, and while we're doing that, try to effectively intervene with harm reduction types of strategies within existing encampments. So just kind of in hockey parlance, this would be kind of rag the puck until we know more. This is kind of what I'm hearing, what you're doing. Interesting, but I'm wondering if in the meantime, what about the status of the encampments themselves? I'm going to put a very focused question to you. Would you legalize the encampments during this interregnum period until you know more?
Who wants that? Tiger team?
I can take that one.
Victoria, go ahead.
To be completely frank, that's potentially a question that we haven't fully thought of. And I think that would be conversations that we would need to have with municipalities first and foremost. The municipalities, while the provincial government funds our policing and all of that kind of stuff, municipalities at the core of it are the ones that are dealing with encampment specifically. That would need to be a bigger discussion on what municipalities see a benefit, if there would be a benefit to legalizing encampments, if there are serious risks. But ultimately, we are focusing on harm reduction and ensuring that folks have the ability to meet their basic needs. And I think that's where we're really focusing, is we hope that if we were to implement these community action teams, they'd be able to intervene in some of those situations before they got to the point where we were seeing encampments, especially those to the degree that we saw in Edmonton with Camp Peckaway. So I think we're really focused here on intervening before it gets to that point. But in the short term, I think we would need to work with municipalities to decide the best foot forward regarding potential encampment pop-ups.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll move to Janet Golding. Janet, have you got a question you want?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks to the Tiger team for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you about perhaps the impact of the data limitations that you flagged on the success of the previous provincial strategy. So you raised the fact that the strategy is over 10 years old now, but it seems to still be the guiding principle in Alberta. Can you just speak to where you see some of the challenges and how that data gap has perhaps limited the effectiveness of the strategy that's in place now?
Who wants to take that one? Paul, Nelson, Natalie, Victoria?
Sorry, could I just get you to repeat that question one more time? I think I just missed a little part of it.
It's okay.
Sure,
Go ahead,
yeah.
Jen.
Just in relation to the current provincial strategy, you've mentioned that it's over 10 years old, and that really what we need is to take a look at the current context. And a lot of your proposal looks at how we can use data to kind of move this strategy forward. I just wondered if you could comment on how the lack of data has limited the previous provincial strategy.
Yeah, for sure. So in our understanding of the previous 10-year plan, there's a lot of assumptions made about what the needs of unhoused people are. Say, for example, like shelters are one of the ways to address unhoused people, but it doesn't account for the reasons why some of these folks might choose not to use shelters. You know, there's concerns with personal belongings, as we mentioned a couple of times, cultural sensitivity issues, and additionally, like COVID-19. A lot of reasons that folks might not use some of these services, including like distrust with government. And I feel like those types of questions haven't been quite addressed quite yet. So having a fuller understanding of that will allow us to create more targeted policies and programs to address the specific needs of those people.
Okay, thank you, Nelson. So we got time. Susie McDonald, last question.
Yeah, you spent, and thanks for the presentation. You spent you spent time in the beginning just talking about the changing nature of the situation and raised issues like climate change and the opioid crisis. But then your solutions focus really on the ground kind of approach. Is there a bigger role for the federal or provincial government in addressing some of the root causes of this crisis?
So you got 30 seconds, folks. Who wants to take it?
I would say absolutely. And in the meantime, that's why we have to gather that data. Of course, we know that homeless populations, generally that is associated with the federal government to address homelessness. But we don't have the information. Like we said, this this 10-year plan was written actually more than 10 years ago. It was written in 2007 to 2008. And like you said, we've seen climate change. In 6 months, we go from the hottest temperature ever in Edmonton to -30, right? To massive forest fires. So we need to take that step back and see what the province can do and what the federal government can do, because we're just getting band-aid solutions. And frankly, the situation is getting worse. So
Okay,
that's why
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm-
Thank you.
We have to cut you off there, Paul, sorry.